people, the lavishness of it all. But tonight, there was a strange energy in the air. The usual excitement that surrounded these parties felt off. The people around me looked normal enough, but their eyes, those empty glazed eyes, gave me an unsettling feeling. I tried to shake off the thought and focus on the music, on the rhythmic beats that usually help me lose myself in the crowd. But I couldn't ignore the fact that no one was dancing like they usually did. There was no joy in the movements, only a stiff, robotic sway. It was as if they were all going through the motions, like they didn't quite know how they got here or why they were still here. Then there was the host. Diddy himself stood on the raised platform in the center of the room, towering above everyone, his ever-present smile as wide as ever. But I couldn't help but notice the faint flicker in his eyes, the slight twitch in the corner of his mouth. It was almost as if he was forcing that smile. There was something about him tonight that made me uneasy. He had this way of looking at you, as though he could see right through you. And for some reason, I felt like I was being watched the whole time, not just by Diddy, but by the walls, the floor, the shadows that crept around every corner of the room. The first story I heard from someone who had attended a similar party sticks with me, more vividly than I care to admit. The woman, a regular at these lavish affairs, had told me about a particular night that would haunt her forever. She was an ambitious, vibrant young woman who had always been drawn to the glitz and glamour of these exclusive Diddy parties, the kind of woman who wore her confidence like a badge of honor. But on that night, something felt wrong. She had entered the venue just like any other, the same bustling crowd, the same flashing lights, the same intoxicating music. But this time, as she made her way through the club, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't supposed to be there. She found herself surrounded by unfamiliar faces, people she didn't remember inviting, faces she couldn't place. A man, tall and gaunt, had made eye contact with her from across the room. He didn't smile like the others, but there was a knowing look in his eyes, a look that sent a chill down her spine. She felt his gaze follow her everywhere she went, his presence stalking her, although he never approached her, just watched from afar. The night went on, and as the music grew louder and the drinks flowed freely, her unease began to intensify. The man remained in her peripheral vision, never quite leaving, always watching. She tried to brush it off, telling herself that it was just her imagination, but something told her it wasn't. Later in the evening, she noticed something that truly terrified her. Diddy. He wasn't acting like his usual charismatic self. Instead of greeting guests with his usual charm, he moved through the crowd, his eyes scanning the room like he was looking for something, or someone. That's when it happened. The man who had been watching her all night suddenly approached. He didn't speak at first. He just stood there, his eyes never leaving hers. Then, in a voice so low it was barely a whisper, he said, "You don't belong here." A shiver ran down her spine. The words felt like they had been pulled from her very soul, like he knew something she didn't. But before she could respond, he vanished back into the crowd, leaving her standing there, heart pounding, drenched in sweat. That night, she couldn't shake the feeling that the party was more than it seemed, that Diddy was hiding something dark beneath his sparkling facade. But the real horror came later. The next day, she awoke in her bed, her head pounding from the night's festivities. As she sat up and rubbed her eyes, she noticed something strange. Her phone, which she had left on the table next to her bed, was flashing with notifications. But as she unlocked it, her heart skipped a beat. There was a message, sent from an unknown number, a message that simply read, "You should have left when you had the chance." The message was accompanied by a single chilling photo, her face taken from behind, with a tall She tried to reach out to the people who had been with her that night, but they were all strangely quiet. None of them responded, as though they hadn't seen her in weeks. It was as if they had vanished from her life completely. That was the last time she ever attended a Diddy party. The second story is from a man who once worked as part of the security team at one of these infamous events. He had heard the rumors, of course, the whispers that ran through the staff about strange things happening at these parties, things that no one could explain. But he didn't believe in any of it. He was a skeptic, someone who always chalked everything up to coincidence or overactive imaginations. That was until one fateful night. It started like any other Diddy party. The guest list was filled with high-profile names, the crowd was rowdy, and the drinks flowed without end. But as the night wore on, the energy began to change. The air grew thick with tension, and people began acting differently. A young woman approached the bar, her hands trembling as she ordered a drink. She had a wide-eyed look in her eyes, as if she were trapped in a nightmare she couldn't wake from. The bartender tried to offer her a drink, but she refused, her voice shaky. "It's not right here," she whispered, glancing nervously over her shoulder. The security guard tried to calm her, but before he could ask her what she meant, she was gone, vanished into the crowd, swallowed by the madness of the party. He turned around, a confused expression on his face, only to see the same woman standing at the far end of the room, staring at him with wide, empty eyes. He moved toward her, his steps quick and urgent, but by the time he reached her, she had disappeared again. At first, he thought he had imagined it. After all, the club was packed, the music loud and the lights flashing. But then it happened again, and again. The woman was everywhere, always just a step ahead of him, always staring from a distance, her eyes filled with something he couldn't comprehend. And every time he got closer, she vanished into thin air like a ghost. That night, the security guard's shift ended early. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, something that wasn't human, something that belonged to the party. But when he spoke to his colleagues, they all told him the same thing. It was just part of the show. Yet, the images of that woman, those cold, lifeless eyes, haunted him for weeks. He never worked another Diddy party again. The final story is one I stumbled upon through whispers among the staff, the kind of story that is never meant to see the light of day. It was about a man who had been attending a private party, a particularly exclusive Diddy event. This was an event unlike any other, held in a secret location, known only to the highest-tiered guests. This man had been invited by a friend, someone who had connections to the elite of the social scene. The venue was lavish, a sprawling mansion on a cliff, overlooking a dark, tumultuous sea. The setting itself gave him an eerie feeling, but it was nothing compared to what happened inside. As the night unfolded, the music, the alcohol, the extravagant guests, all of it began to blur together in a haze. The man lost track of time, wandering through rooms he had never seen, rooms that seemed to stretch on forever, corridors that led to nowhere. He eventually found himself in a room at the back of the house, where Diddy himself stood, watching over the party like a puppet master. There, in the center of the room, was an ornate mirror, its surface covered in dust, as though it hadn't been touched in years. The man stared into it, but what he saw in the reflection wasn't his own face. Instead, he saw a room filled with people, a room filled with ghosts. The room seemed to shift in the mirror, the walls bending and warping, and then, just as quickly, everything returned to normal. Diddy's eyes locked with his, a smirk spreading across his face. But the man didn't need to ask. He already knew. The party was never just a party. and he had just crossed into something far darker than he could ever imagine. Some say the man disappeared that night. Others claim he's still out there, lost in the labyrinthine halls of that mansion, forever searching for an escape that doesn't exist. But no one has ever confirmed the truth, and no one ever will, because once you enter a Diddy party, you don't leave. Not really. And those who do, they leave behind pieces of themselves, scattered across the dance floor, waiting for the next party to come. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being drawn deeper into something I didn't understand. The music, the crowd, the flashing lights, they all blurred into a surreal haze that made everything feel more like a dream than reality. As I pushed my way through the maze of bodies, something I couldn't place, felt wrong. It wasn't just the strange energy in the air or the oppressive weight of the darkness creeping in around the edges of the club. It was the way the people moved. They swayed as if controlled by some unseen hand, their eyes glazed over, vacant. I tried to focus, to push past the growing sense of dread clawing at the back of my mind. I was here to have fun, to let go for a night, not to get lost in fear. But the longer I stayed, the more the unease gnawed at me. The laughter around me seemed too forced, the smiles too wide. I found myself on the outer edge of the dance floor, the shadows in the corners of the room almost swallowing the space. The dim light from the chandeliers above flickered erratically, casting long, jagged shadows that seemed to shift unnaturally. For a moment, I thought I saw something dart across the room, but when I blinked, it was gone. I couldn't even tell if it was a person or just a trick of the light. I turned to look for Diddy, hoping to see him up on the platform again, smiling, charismatic as ever. He had always been the center of attention, and in these parties, his energy was magnetic, almost hypnotic. But now, from the corner of my eye, I saw him standing off to the side, his back to the crowd. His figure was strangely still, almost statue-like, his arms at his sides. There was something off about the way he stood. His posture was too rigid, too perfect. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. He had always been larger than life, a force of nature at these events. But tonight, there was a heaviness about him, a sense of waiting. Waiting for what? I couldn't put it into words, but I had to look away. The room seemed to close in on me. The music had grown quieter, or maybe it was just my perception of it. Either way, it felt muffled, as if I were underwater. The people around me were still moving, but there was a strange detachment in their actions. I watched one woman, her face frozen in a wide smile as she sipped from her glass. She didn't blink, not once. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, never wavered as she stared ahead, her body moving in time with the beat, but her gaze was distant, as if she were looking through me, not at me. I took a deep breath, trying to push the anxiety aside. Maybe I was just tired, or maybe it was the drink. I hadn't had much, but the feeling of disconnection, of being in a place that wasn't quite right, was getting stronger by the second. Then I heard it, soft at first, a whisper that sent a jolt through my body. Not supposed to be here. I froze. The voice was so quiet, it could have been a figment of my imagination. But no, there it was again, clearer this time. Not supposed to be here. It was coming from behind me. I turned slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. Standing just a few feet away, almost as if she had materialized out of thin air, was a woman. She was dressed in an elegant black dress, her hair pulled tightly back, but her face was pale, almost sickly, her lips thin and drawn. Her eyes, wide and frantic, were darting around the room, not unlike the woman I had seen earlier in the night. She was staring directly at me now, her gaze locking onto mine with an intensity know what this place is?" Her voice was weak, strained, as though speaking took all her strength. I didn't answer. What could I say? I didn't know. I didn't want to know. But before I could make my move, she grabbed my arm. Her grip was surprisingly strong for someone so fragile-looking, and the coldness of her hand sent a shock through my body. Her eyes were frantic now. "You have to leave. You don't understand. They won't let you leave. None of us can leave." A shiver ran down my spine. I tried to pull my arm away, but her grip tightened, her nails digging into my skin like claws. "Please, listen to me," she gasped. "There's no escape. He won't let you. He doesn't let anyone leave." My heart raced. Diddy, what was she talking about? Before I could ask, her face contorted in pain. Her eyes rolled back in her head, and for a split second, I thought she was going to collapse. But she didn't. Instead, she jerked violently, and then, just like that, she was gone, vanished into thin air. I stood there, frozen in place, unsure of what had just happened. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. Had it been real? Was I losing my mind? Or was this just part of the party, some kind of twisted performance? I took a shaky breath, trying to steady myself. I couldn't stay here, not anymore. My gut was telling me to leave, to get out of this suffocating, oppressive space. But the longer I stood there, the more the room seemed to pull me in, as if I were tethered to the darkness that hung heavy in the air. I looked up toward the platform again. Diddy was still standing there, facing the crowd, but this time, his eyes were locked onto mine. His gaze was piercing, unsettling, as if he had been waiting for me to notice him. There was no smile now, no charm. His expression was empty, hollow. The crowd around him seemed to shift, like a wave rippling through the people, pulling them in and out of focus. I could barely make out the faces. They were distorted, their features stretched and shifting in unnatural ways. The air grew thicker, heavier. The room felt like it was closing in on me, the walls pressing in from all sides. I could feel the heat of the bodies around me, but there was no air. It felt as though I were suffocating, but no one else seemed to notice. No one was reacting. They just kept dancing, their movements mechanical, synchronized. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned on my heel and began to push my way toward the exit. My pulse was hammering in my ears. I needed to get out. But as I moved, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, that something or someone was just behind me, keeping pace with my every step. I glanced over my shoulder. Nothing. No one. I kept moving, faster now, my breath coming in short gasps. The crowd seemed to part around me, their faces unreadable. But there was one woman, standing at the edge of the crowd, her expression empty, that I couldn't ignore. Her eyes met mine, and I felt a cold shiver race down my spine. She was the same woman I had seen earlier, the one with the unblinking eyes. But now, her face was different, twisted. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her mouth hung open in an unnatural way, as if she were screaming but couldn't make a sound. And then, just as I was about to reach the exit, I heard it. A low, guttural sound, so faint at first that I almost missed it. But then it grew louder, closer, the sound of scratching. It was coming from behind me, from the walls, from beneath the floorboards. I didn't dare turn around. I didn't want to know what it was. But the closer I got to the door, the louder the scratching became, until it was deafening. The door was only a few feet away now, and I pushed through the crowd, my heart racing. I could almost taste the air outside, feel the coolness on my skin. Just one more step, and then the lights flickered again, plunging the room into darkness, a stillness so complete, it was like the world itself had paused. And then, an explosion of noise, as if the crowd had all collectively inhaled in shock, a single unified breath. The lights flickered back on, but everything had changed. The people were gone. The club was empty, except for one thing. In the center of the room, standing in front of me, was Diddy. His smile was gone, replaced by a cold, dead stare. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. I knew then that I hadn't been allowed to leave. Not yet. Not ever. And I wasn't the only one. The music had stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating, like a thick blanket pressed over my chest, pushing the air from my lungs. My eyes darted around the room, trying to comprehend what had just happened. One moment, the club was alive with people dancing, talking, laughing, and the next, it was empty. The flashing lights were gone, replaced by an oppressive dim light that seemed to emanate from nowhere. I stood frozen at the center of the dance floor, the heavy sound of my own breathing drowning out the quiet. There was no sign of the crowd, no trace of the people who had surrounded me just moments ago. But the eerie emptiness wasn't the worst of it. It was the feeling that the room had shifted, subtly but unmistakably. The walls felt closer, as though they were pressing in on me from every side. Then there was the smell. It wasn't the sharp, metallic scent of sweat that had filled the air during the party. This was something darker, something foul, like decaying wood and damp earth, the kind of smell you'd expect from a place that had been abandoned for years. The air felt thick, almost humid, and the temperature had dropped. I could see my breath in front of me, white puffs of mist hanging in the air. I took a tentative step forward, my feet dragging against the floor as if I were walking through a fog, my legs heavy, reluctant to move. I wanted to scream, to call for help, but no sound came from my mouth. It was as if the air itself had swallowed my voice, leaving me in a world where I couldn't make a sound. Then I saw him, Diddy. He was standing in the same spot he had been earlier, except this time, there was nothing welcoming about his presence. His posture was stiff, unnaturally so, as though he were a puppet on strings, a lifeless figure propped up in place. His eyes were locked onto mine, but they were different now. They weren't the eyes of the man I had seen on stage, full of energy, charisma, and charm. No, these eyes were dark, empty voids, hollow. I took a step back, my heart pounding. Something was wrong. I didn't know what it was, but I knew that I wasn't supposed to be here. Get out, I whispered to myself, but the words felt foreign, like they didn't belong to me. The room seemed to react to my thoughts, the temperature dropping even further. My skin crawled as though invisible hands were brushing against me, pulling at my clothes, tugging at my hair. The silence stretched on, suffocating, and the more I stared at Diddy, the more I felt my body growing heavier. It was as if his gaze was pulling me in, as though I were caught in a tractor beam, unable to look away, unable to break free. I tried to look around, to find a way out, but everything felt wrong. The walls, the floor, even the ceiling. They seemed to shift, becoming more distorted, the angles more acute, the edges sharper. Nothing in this room felt real anymore. A soft whisper broke the silence, and I turned my head, heart leaping into my throat. But there was no one there. I was alone, but I wasn't. The whispers continued, growing louder, each syllable more frantic than the last. They were coming from all directions now, whispers in my ears, under my skin, all around me. The sound of thousands of voices, murmuring in a language I couldn't understand, the words slipping through my mind like oil through water, slick and elusive. I stumbled backwards, my legs giving way beneath me as the floor seemed to tilt. I hit the ground hard, my hands scraping against the cold, damp tiles beneath me. I tried to push myself up, but something held me down. A weight, a pressure that came from the floor itself, as if the very building were alive, pulsing with something dark and malevolent. And then I saw it. A movement in the shadows. Something shifting, something moving in the corner of my vision. I turned my head quickly, but there was nothing there. Just darkness, like the void was opening up before me, swallowing everything. I blinked, and for a moment, I thought I saw a face, pale, gaunt, its features twisted and unrecognizable, its mouth open in a silent scream. I could feel my breath quickening, my heart pounding in my chest as the whispers grew louder, more urgent. I looked around wildly, but the room was the same, empty. The people were gone, the lights were dim, and the shadows seemed to be moving. No longer static, they danced, shifting like living things, creeping along the floor and up the walls. Something was wrong with this place. Something was wrong with the whole damn party. I needed to leave, but the door, the one I had been heading for earlier, was gone. There was no exit, no way out. The room seemed to be stretching, the walls pushing in on me, pulling me deeper into its suffocating embrace. The air was thick, too thick to breathe, and with every inhale, it felt like I was drowning. I tried to scream again, but nothing came out. My mouth opened, but there was no sound. The silence was deafening. It felt like I was trapped in some kind of distorted nightmare, unable to wake up, unable to escape. Then suddenly, the floor beneath me shifted. The tile cracked. A sound so sharp, so loud, it tore through the silence like a gunshot, followed by a low rumble, like the earth itself was groaning. I scrambled to my feet, but the ground continued to shift, the cracks spreading like spider webs across the floor. A sharp, jagged edge of stone pushed up from the center of the room, rising slowly, impossibly, as if the very foundation of the building was breaking apart. I backed away slowly, my eyes fixed on the floor as it warped and contorted, as if it were alive, struggling to escape something buried deep beneath it. The stone that had risen began to split, revealing a dark, gaping hole in the ground. The hole seemed to pulse, the edges writhing like something alive, something that should never have been seen. I could feel the temperature drop further, the cold biting at my skin as I took another step back, my legs trembling with fear. The whispers grew louder again, their frantic tone rising to a frantic crescendo. Then the lights flickered again. I saw him, Diddy. But now, he wasn't standing still anymore. He was moving, slowly, as if the gravity in the room had changed, his movements jerky, unnatural, like he was fighting against some invisible force. His head tilted at an odd angle, his eyes still locked onto mine, but this time, I saw something different in them, something deeper, darker. It was as if he was waiting for something. His lips didn't move, but I could hear his voice, low and guttural, vibrating through my chest. "You should have left when you had the chance," he whispered, the words carrying a weight, a finality to them that sent chills down my spine. The room seemed to grow darker, the shadows in the corners of the walls lengthening, stretching towards me like they were trying to grab hold of me. I could feel their presence. Something was watching me. Something was closing in, pressing in from all sides. And then, in a blink, the room seemed to shift again. The walls were closer now. The ceiling was lower. It was like the entire space had been distorted, warped by some unseen force. And in that brief moment of disorientation, I felt it. Something cold, something wet brushing against the back of my neck. I spun around, but there was nothing there, just the thick darkness. And then, oppressive silence of the room. My heart pounded in my chest, the sound almost deafening. I didn't dare move, not even to breathe, as if somehow making a sound might make the presence in the darkness aware of me. The air was thick, heavy with the weight of something ancient and malevolent, pressing in on me from all sides. I turned, my body trembling, eyes searching the corners of the room. The shadows seemed to stretch further, taking on shapes that shifted and writhed just beyond the edge of my vision. It was as though the darkness itself was alive, a living thing that was watching me, waiting for me to make a move. The growling was louder now, almost close enough to feel it vibrating through the floor beneath me. It was deep, guttural, a sound so primal it sent waves of terror crashing over me. My breath caught in my throat as I took a cautious step back, my mind racing for any way to escape, but I could see no way out. The room felt endless, the walls stretching further and further, as though the space was expanding, folding in on itself, trapping me. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something. A figure. A dark silhouette, standing in the center of the room, completely still. Its shape was not quite human, its proportions wrong, too elongated, too twisted. It seemed to loom, towering over me, its presence filling the space. The darkness seemed to cling to it, wrapping around its form like smoke, obscuring its features. I couldn't look away. I felt myself being pulled toward it, my legs moving without my control, drawn like a moth to a flame, even as my mind screamed at me to stop. But it was no use. The room was closing in, suffocating me, and my body moved as though it had been possessed, carried forward by some unseen force. The growl turned into a low, rumbling chuckle, deep and slow, like the sound of stones grinding together. I froze, a shiver racing down my spine. The figure's form began to shift, its limbs stretching, distorting as it moved, as though it were being pulled and twisted by invisible strings. Then it spoke. Not so easy to escape, is it? The voice was low and cold, like ice scraping across glass. I couldn't tell where it came from. It seemed to fill the entire room, resonating in my skull, reverberating through my bones. It felt like the walls were speaking, like the very building was alive and aware, watching me with eyes I couldn't see. "Where are they?" I gasped, my throat dry, my voice barely a whisper. "Where did they go?" The figure didn't answer at first. It merely tilted its head slightly to one side, its features still shrouded in darkness, its face hidden behind a veil of shadow. But I could feel its eyes on me, the weight of its gaze pressing down on me, and that's when I realized it wasn't alone. The shadows in the corners of the room were moving again. Something was shifting in the darkness. I could hear faint rustling, a sound that didn't belong, something scraping against the floor, something dragging itself closer. The shadows seemed to pulse, like they were alive, crawling along the walls, reaching for me. I tried to back away, but my legs felt heavy, as if the very floor beneath me had become a sticky trap. My feet dragged against the ground, the air becoming thicker with every step. My hands shook as I reached out, searching for something, anything to hold on to, but there was nothing. The room had become an endless void, the walls and floor dissolving into the darkness. Then, without warning, the figure in the center of the room moved. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, as though it were struggling against some invisible force, but it was moving toward me. Each step was slow, deliberate, and I could hear the sound sense of dread, a deep, suffocating terror that threatened to consume me. I wanted to run, to scream, but my body refused to move, frozen in place as the figure drew closer, its presence growing more oppressive with every passing second. Then, I heard the whisper again. It wasn't a voice anymore. It was like a presence, a thought that slipped into my mind, wrapping around my thoughts like a vine, squeezing tighter and tighter. You should have left when you had the chance. The words weren't just spoken. They felt like they were etched into my soul, carving into me, marking me, leaving something behind that would never be erased. I gasped, my heart racing, but the sound was gone. The figure was no longer speaking, no longer moving. It was still, its head tilted slightly, its empty eyes locked onto mine. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. My entire body was frozen, my limbs paralyzed with fear. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the figure stepped backward into the shadows, disappearing without a trace. The growl stopped. The whispers ceased. For a brief, fleeting moment, there was silence, but it wasn't peaceful. The darkness seemed to thicken, the air heavy with an oppressive force that pushed down on me, as though something was waiting, watching. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach, a gnawing sense of something terrible, something ancient, lurking just out of reach. My heart hammered in my chest, the sound of it deafening in my ears. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. The shadows were closing in again. They were moving faster now, crawling along the floor, creeping up the walls, gathering in the corners of the room like a gathering storm. The walls seemed to bend, the angles becoming sharper, the room warping, stretching, as if reality itself was unraveling. I took a step backward, my feet slipping against the floor, but there was no way to escape. The walls were closing in, the shadows crawling toward me, and the whispers were growing louder again, more frantic, more desperate. You're too late. The voice seemed to come from everywhere at once. The walls, the floor, the ceiling. It was as if the building itself was speaking, taunting me, mocking me. The air grew colder, and I felt the weight of 1,000 eyes on me, invisible forces pressing against me from every direction. I turned again, trying to find some way out, but there was no exit. The door was gone. The windows were nothing but blackness. The room had become a maze of shadows, a prison with no escape. The floor shifted again beneath my feet, a low groan echoing through the building. I could feel the ground trembling beneath me, as if the very foundation of the room were cracking, breaking apart. My vision blurred, the edges of the room stretching out of focus, the shadows growing darker, more oppressive. And then, in the distance, I heard it again, a low, guttural growl. It was closer now, much closer, and I realized, with a sickening sense of dread, that it wasn't just the darkness I had to fear. It was what lurked inside it. I could feel the pressure in the room, a heavy weight settling over me like the thick, suffocating fog that had rolled in during an unusually cold night. The walls felt like they were closing in, inch by inch, as if the very room itself was shifting, contorting into something else, something unrecognizable. My heart raced in my chest, every beat a reminder of how desperately I wanted to escape, but the room wouldn't let me. I stumbled backward, my feet slipping over the cracked tiles, the cold floor sending tremors up my spine. I reached out, fingers brushing against the smooth surface of the wall, but it wasn't solid anymore. It had changed, becoming slick and soft, like it was made of something that wasn't stone, wasn't brick, something alive. I could feel it pulse under my touch, a slow, rhythmic throb, like the building itself had a heartbeat. The air was thick now, almost gelatinous, as though it was pressing against me from all sides. Each breath invisible weight that filled the room. I couldn't breathe right. My chest ached, my throat tight with fear, but I couldn't stop. I had to keep moving. I turned, eyes scanning the space around me. The shadows had shifted again, becoming more pronounced, more defined, creeping along the floor like tendrils of smoke. I could see them stretching, curling up the walls, coiling like snakes, as if the darkness itself were trying to claim me. And then, in the center of the room, I saw it. A figure. At first, it was only a shape, just a silhouette. But as I looked closer, the details began to form. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs too long, too thin. It loomed in the center of the room, just beyond the reach of the dim light, its outline jagged and unnatural. The more I stared, the more distorted its features became, as though they were shifting, warping, blending into the shadows. My breath caught in my throat as I realized it was moving. But it wasn't walking. No, it was floating, gliding across the floor, its body hovering just above the ground, its legs unnaturally bent at odd angles. Each movement was slow, deliberate, like it was savoring my fear. I tried to back away, but the room seemed to stretch around me, the distance between me and the figure growing shorter with every step I took, as if the very space was shrinking, pulling me closer to whatever that thing was. The shadows twisted, reaching out, slithering along the floor, crawling up my legs like tendrils, cold and clammy, wrapping themselves around me, tightening their grip. I tried to shake them off, but they clung to me, holding me in place. The figure moved closer, its shape flickering in and out of focus, like it was made of smoke or mist. It had no discernible face, only a dark void where its features should have been. But I could feel its presence, feel its eyes, even though I couldn't see them. They were staring at me, watching me, as though it could see straight through me. I opened my mouth to scream, but the sound caught in my throat, strangled by the heavy silence that seemed to suffocate everything. The room was closing in, the shadows swallowing the last remnants of light, until there was nothing left but the figure and me, standing in the center of this twisted, distorted world. And then, the whispers started again, soft at first, like distant murmurs, barely audible over the pounding of my heart. But they grew louder, sharper, more urgent. They were all around me, inside my head, circling like flies, drowning out every other thought, every other sound. The voices were indistinct, but I could feel them, like cold fingers brushing against my skin, creeping into my mind. Run. You should have run. It's too late. The words slithered through my thoughts, each one colder than the last, filling me with dread, with an overwhelming sense of doom. I couldn't escape. There was nowhere to go. The whispers were endless, never stopping, never letting up. They were all around me now, drowning me in their dark promises. I stumbled forward, my feet dragging, my body no longer responding to my commands. The darkness seemed to swallow me whole, pulling me deeper into the void. The shadows were closing in again, too fast, too fast. I tried to scream, but no sound came. My mouth was dry, my throat tight, and the fear was so thick, so palpable, I could taste it on my tongue. The figure was closer now, its distorted form towering over me. I could feel it above me, feel the weight of its presence pressing down on me, suffocating me. I wanted to turn and run, but my body refused to obey. I was rooted to the spot, frozen in terror. The growl came again, low and guttural, a sound that reverberated through my bones. It was no longer a distant noise. was right behind me, close enough to feel. I could feel the vibrations in my chest, could hear the scrape of its claws against the floor, the unmistakable sound of something unnatural, something otherworldly. I turned, barely able to move, and there it was, close enough that I could see the shadow of its face, twisted and contorted, a dark abyss that seemed to pulse with malice. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, were nothing but black voids, endless and hollow, staring at me like it knew everything I had ever done, every mistake I had ever made. It knew me. A cold shiver ran down my spine as I realized the truth. It wasn't just the darkness I had to fear. It was the thing that lived inside it, the thing that had been watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. It was the thing that had been pulling the strings all along, manipulating the shadows, twisting reality itself. It was the reason everyone else had disappeared, the reason the room had become this nightmare. I tried to run again, but my legs wouldn't move. I was paralyzed. The shadows had already claimed me, their cold fingers wrapping tighter and tighter around my limbs, holding me in place. The figure stepped forward, its form shifting, its body expanding and contracting like it was trying to take shape, trying to form something recognizable. But it never did. It remained a monstrous, shifting thing, a creature of darkness, an entity beyond comprehension. It tilted its head, as though studying me, and I could feel its gaze piercing into my soul. Its presence was suffocating, overwhelming. I couldn't escape it. I couldn't even fight it. It was as if the room itself had turned against me, and all I could do was wait for whatever it was to consume me, to pull me into the shadows with the rest of them. The whispering grew louder, more frantic, more desperate. The voices were no longer just words. They were screams, cries for help, cries of terror, all tangled together, merging into a cacophony of noise that drowned out everything else. I could feel it then, the darkness closing in around me, the weight of it pressing down on me like 1,000 hands, pulling me into the abyss. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I felt something cold, something wet, touch my skin, something sharp. I gasped, but my lungs couldn't fill with air. The cold spread through me, invading every part of me, and the room seemed to shift again, twisting, folding, as if the world itself was collapsing in on me. I closed my eyes, unable to bear the sight, unable to take the pressure anymore. The growl was right behind me now, and I could feel it, could feel the presence of whatever it was, whatever it had become, pressing against me. And then, in the distance, I heard a sound, a door opening, but it was too far. And then, everything went dark. It was hard to tell whether I was still awake. The darkness had become all-consuming, a blanket of thick, inky blackness that smothered everything, making it impossible to differentiate between the waking world and whatever nightmare I had wandered into. The cold had intensified, seeping through my skin, into my bones. My teeth chattered from the chill, but I could no longer tell whether it was the cold of the room or the fear that had paralyzed me to the point of numbness. I tried to move my limbs, but my body refused to cooperate. I was frozen, trapped in a state somewhere between sleep and consciousness, between life and something far worse. The air around me thickened, pressing against my chest with the weight of 1,000 unseen hands. My breath came in shallow, panicked bursts, but no sound escaped my lips. It was as though the room had stolen my voice, just as it had stolen everything else. Then, a low, ominous hum filled the space. It started faintly, as though coming from a distant source, series of dissonant tones, shifting and morphing into something that scraped against the edge of sanity. The hum seemed to stretch and contract, an eerie, pulsating rhythm, like the thudding of some unseen heart beating in the void around me. I forced my eyes open, though I wasn't sure why. There was nothing to see. The darkness was impenetrable, an unyielding sea that swallowed everything. Still, I couldn't help but search for something, anything to cling to. I reached out, my hand trembling, desperate for something solid, but all I encountered was the suffocating emptiness. I was alone. Or was I? A flash of movement. So quick, I could have sworn it was my imagination playing tricks on me. But then it happened again, and this time, I couldn't dismiss it. The shadows, they were shifting. Not just the shadows on the walls, the shadows themselves were moving. They slithered and writhed, curling into shapes that weren't supposed to be. They stretched toward me, reaching out with invisible hands, as though they were hungry, eager to claim me, to drag me into whatever twisted world lay just beyond the edge of my perception. I flinched, my skin crawling with the realization that I wasn't alone. The shadows weren't just dark, they were sentient, alive, and they were aware of me. The hum shifted. It was no longer just a sound, it had become something more. It was as though the room itself had become a living, breathing entity, and the hum was its voice, calling to me, pulling me deeper into its embrace. The walls felt closer now, too close, their cold surfaces pressing against me, as if they were inching toward me, suffocating me. I tried to scream again, but still no sound came. Then, a sharp, sudden noise, a scraping, dragging sound, broke through the silence. It was a low, painful noise, like metal on metal, scraping against stone. I could feel it in my bones, the vibration resonating through the very air. The noise was coming closer, closer. The floor beneath me seemed to tremble, and I could feel the vibrations moving through my body. The air grew thick, like it was charged with static, crackling with an energy that made my skin crawl. The darkness shifted once more. Something was moving in it. I blinked rapidly, trying to focus, to make sense of what was happening. At first, I couldn't see anything, but then, there, at the edge of the room, a silhouette appeared. It was tall, unnaturally so, its shape almost blending with the shadows themselves, as though it were part of them. The figure stood still for a moment, a strange stillness hanging in the air like a breath held too long, and then it moved. The movement was unsettling, unnatural, like something you weren't meant to witness, a distortion of reality itself. It glided across the room, its limbs bending at impossible angles, its body stretching and contracting in ways that made my stomach turn. Each movement was jerky, fragmented, as though it was being controlled by unseen strings, puppeteered by something far more sinister than I could comprehend. The figure was close now, too close. I could see it more clearly, though I wished I couldn't. Its face was wrong. It was nothing but a dark void, a featureless mask of emptiness that seemed to absorb the very light around it. No eyes, no mouth, no nose, just darkness. But I could feel its presence, its gaze, as though it were watching me, studying me, trying to understand me in a way that made my skin crawl. And then, a voice, not a sound, but a thought. It slipped into my mind, a whisper so quiet it felt like a secret that had been buried too long. "Do you feel it?" I didn't answer. I couldn't move. The pressure in the room was unbearable, like the walls were closing in on me. The floor floor sinking beneath my feet. The figure moved again, its limbs stretching toward me, the air growing colder with each step it took. "You are not alone," the voice whispered again, this time louder, sharper, as though it were standing right beside me. "You never were." A cold, clammy hand brushed against my arm, sending a shock of icy terror through my body. I jerked back, but there was nowhere to go. The walls pressed in closer, the figure looming over me, its presence suffocating. The hum grew louder, the sound vibrating through the floor and into my bones, until I thought my head would explode from the pressure. The shadows twisted around me, coiling like serpents, and the figure leaned in closer, its distorted face filling my vision. "It's too late for you," it whispered. "Too late for them." And then, just as quickly as it had come, the figure retreated back into the shadows, its presence dissipating into the darkness, leaving me frozen, gasping for air. I tried to move again, but my body wouldn't respond. I was trapped, caught in this nightmare, unable to escape. The hum faded, but the silence that followed was worse than the noise had been. It was a suffocating, oppressive silence, thick with the weight of everything I couldn't understand, everything I was too terrified to comprehend. The shadows had returned to their natural state, motionless, empty, but I could still feel them, watching me, pressing against my skin, reaching for me from every corner of the room. I wasn't alone. I never had been. The darkness, it wasn't just here. It was everywhere. It was inside me now, in my mind, in my thoughts, in my very soul. I could feel it, curling around the edges of my consciousness, waiting for me to slip, to falter, to give in to the terror that gnawed at the edges of my sanity. There was no escape. There was only the growing darkness, the suffocating pressure, and the overwhelming certainty that whatever had been waiting for me, whatever had been pulling me deeper into this nightmare, was not